I'm so excited to be here with you all today to talk about the life and work of League alumna Pasita Abad. This talk accompanies an exhibition, as Ksenia mentioned, that is currently on view at the Walker Art Center, and it is Pasita's first retrospective. And for those of you who won't have a chance to make it out to Minneapolis in the next few months, I am happy to share that it will also be traveling to New York in spring of 2024, and it'll be on view at MoMA PS1. So I hope you can catch it there. So before I jump in, I thought I would just share some installation shots of the exhibition at the Walker, just so that you can get a sense of the breadth of her practice. And you can see in these images kind of the monumentality of her scale, the exuberance of her color and texture, and keep that in kind of your mind as we walk through her life and career. So the exhibition, as I mentioned, is Pasita's first retrospective. So it brings together over 100 objects that span the entirety of her 32-year career. And it starts with some of her early drawings that she made as a student at the Art Students League, and then ends with some of her latest works before she died in 2004. But the exhibition really centers on her trapunto paintings. And so these are what you're seeing in these images. And to describe trapunto, it's a technique that she innovated in the early 80s. She learned it from a friend and then kind of developed it and made it her own. But essentially, it's a hybrid form of painting and quilting. And so generally, when you think about painting, you think about applying, oil or acrylic onto canvas, and then stretching that over stretcher bars and adding a frame. And so it's a pretty kind of taut, work of art. But for Pasita, she actually painted her canvases and then she quilted them. And so it's a little hard to tell probably from these images, but I'll show some close-ups soon. But what she did was she would paint the surfaces of her canvas, and then she would add a layer of batting or stuffing in the center, and then add a backing cloth, and then she would stitch all three of those layers together. And so when you see these works in person, and you can see them against the wall like a painting, or in the round where you can really see the fronts and backs and the making of the works, you can see all of the incredible stitching and hand stitching that goes into every square inch of these artworks. So I'm just scrolling through just to give you a sense of kind of the wide range of her subject matter. You can see she really incorporated textiles into a lot of her making, not just in the form of quilting, but also in terms of patching together, collaging different fabric elements. She made costumes for different theater productions, and then she also made very little distinction between what she put on the wall and what she put on her body in terms of her dress. She would intervene in many of her clothes. In the exhibition too, we have this piece of furniture, which is a coffee table that she collaged fabric scraps onto, and then different elements from her own textile collection. And then this is just the final gallery in the exhibition. And I'll jump into each of these different series shortly. But I wanted to start here because we're at the Students League. And I need to thank Ksenia for sending me Pasita's student card when she was a student here. So when she lived in New York for a number of years in the late 70s, she took classes here, and you can see that the different courses she studied and who she studied with. I know you can see the instructors, John Hellicker and Robert Beverly Hale were two of her instructors. And for Pasita, the Art Students League was really one of her first quote-unquote formal trainings in art making. She called herself a late bloomer, and so growing up in the Philippines, she said that she had very little exposure to art making. And so she took her first kind of formal art class at the age of 30. And then from there, made for decades in really incredible ways. But you see in kind of a primary document like this, the intensity of her studying and her learning. And so In the exhibition, we have some of her very early works. I love this one. It's called My First Still Life, and it's from 1976. And so it was probably, the product of a class exercise, working in, pencil and paper, doing kind of a very traditional still life. But what I love, and we show this development in the exhibition, is looking at a work like this, and then looking at a work like this 5 years later. This is from 1981. And this is an example of her trapunto painting that I had just described, kind of this hybrid form of painting and quilting. And there's a really wonderful story attached to this work that I'll briefly tell because I love it so much. But Jack, her husband, who is here with us tonight, relayed a wonderful story about how this was actually a white tablecloth on their dining table. And Jack, spilled some red wine on it, and instead of, tossing it aside or trying to wash it out, she actually decided to make it into an artwork. And so probably somewhere, in the grapes or in the eggplant, there's that original wine spill. But she renders this incredible cornucopia of fruits and vegetables. And using her trapunto technique, you see in the detail in the image on the right, she outlined every single fruit or vegetable with, a simple running stitch. But in doing so, it brings this kind of, roundedness and voluptuousness to the fruits that adds an incredible dimensionality to the painted work. Another interesting thing to note about this early work is that it has this, black border, a fabric black border, and if some of you are familiar with Faith Ringgold, who of course is another a New York-based artist who works kind of in this hybrid way between painting and quilting, Faith too talked about how very early on in her practice, she would intentionally kind of create borders around her work to claim them as painting, because both of these artists were very aware of the biases in the art world against, forms of quote unquote craft or textile traditions, or incorporating them into art making. So I love thinking, just back and forth between this work from 75 to just 5 years later, another still life in 81. And the question is really, how did she get from, the first to the latter? And the trapunto technique is really what drove her throughout the rest of her career. So I'm going to jump back a little bit and just to situate you, give you a little bit of context about who Pasita Abad was. And in planning the exhibition, we found such incredible photographs in the artist's archives that are on view in the exhibition and in the accompanying catalog. So Pasita was born in 1946. She was one of 12 children, so she had many siblings, and in the photo in the top left, she is second from right. And she was born in Batanes in the Philippines. Batanes is the northernmost island province in the Philippines. It has been described to me as, I think it's 4 miles wide at its widest point. So she came from a very tiny island, but she also came from a political family. And so both of her parents were involved in politics, they served in Congress, and the family actually moved to Manila when Pasita was quite young, once her father first was in Congress. The photo on the bottom is an image of her mother when she was campaigning to be governor of Batanes. This is later in the 80s. But the photo on the right is really spectacular. This is a photo after Pasita. So she, I said her parents were politicians. She was going to follow in her parents' footsteps, studied political science at the University of the Philippines, and led a student demonstration to Malacañang Palace to protest corrupted election results in 1969. And here she is, she has an audience with President Ferdinand Marcos. And so you see, Marcos kind of presiding over this meeting, all of his generals, surrounding him. And this was really leading up to what was known as the First Quarter Storm, when students across the country were protesting what would soon become the Marcos dictatorship. So following this event, Pasita's parents, Pasita says, encouraged her to kind of spend some time away from the Philippines because her family home had been targeted with bullets. Luckily, no one was hurt, but she, decided to stay with an aunt in San Francisco. She was originally going to go to Spain, didn't make it there, landed in San Francisco in 1970. So these are some photos of Pasita when she first got to the United States, and 1970. This was at the height of the counterculture movement, Black Power, the Third World Liberation Strike, where an inter-ethnic coalition of students were really agitating for greater representation at different universities. So the photo in the center actually is of Pasita standing in front of Lone Mountain College, where she got her master's degree and actually wrote her dissertation on Philippine independence in 1898. And so she was probably one of the first students to really study, what is now known as ethnic studies or Asian American studies. These are courses of study that really came about as a result of the Third World Liberation Strike. And it's in San Francisco that she met her husband, Jack. And the two of them, if it gives you a sense of their personalities, after meeting just months later, decided to hitchhike and go on an overland trip from Turkey to the Philippines for a year. And it was really on that trip that Pasita just fell in love with all of the different cultural traditions, textiles in particular. And so the images on the right are actually what Jack refers to as Pasita's first artworks. They're definitely her first forays in any form of creative expression. And so on the top right, you'll see that these embroidered Turkish puppets that she actually embroidered onto one of Jack's shirts as they were traveling. And the shirt was obviously so well loved and worn that it started to fray and fall apart, but Jack had the foresight to kind of cut out these puppets and save them. And on the bottom was this, flared jean, these flared jeans that she actually stitched together to make a denim skirt and then also embroidered along the hem. So this is really kind of the start of her artistic career. This is, again, someone who grew up in the Philippines with very little artistic or exposure to the arts. When in talking to her siblings, they said, being an artist was out of the question. We didn't even know what it meant to be an artist. We were all taught to either, study the hard sciences or political science. And so this was a real kind of shift for Pasita. But after coming back from this trip, she was so determined to become an artist. And the textiles in particular, you'll see, really inflected so much of her practice. So this is a photograph of Pasita standing in front of one of the textiles she collected on that first trip that she and Jack went on in the early 1970s. It's a Polkari that they picked up in Pakistan. And this is one of her very earliest paintings on the right from 1976. It's called Foothill Cabin, and it's actually a portrait of Jack. But you see that Polkari rendered in the background of this painting alongside other textiles. And what I love about this work is, it's not technically so skilled yet. She was working out perspective, and you can see that the figure in the center is supposed to be the focal point. But what I love about it is that it's actually all the fabric elements, the patterns and the colors that are subsuming the figure. So I like to think about this as really Pasita's first form of textile art. So after she, took a couple classes at the Art Students League, and she learned, still life and figurative drawing, and sketching from models, she and Jack traveled extensively. So through Jack's work, he worked as a development economist. They lived, worked, and traveled to over 60 countries in 32 years. And so it was really the travel where Pasita learned, alongside, her more formal training at the Art Students League, she picked up so many forms of making as she was traveling. And so, she was starting to sketch as she traveled around to different countries. She used every surface that she could find. I love this work on the right called Newspaper Lady. And many of her works were inspired by artists that she learned about when she was in New York, like Alice Neel or Ben Shahn, Jacob Lawrence. These were artists who were all influences for her. And she was in particular drawn to rendering depictions of women and children. As Alice Neel, called portraits pictures of people. I think she was very much working in that same vein and loved to, meet people and then ask if she could draw them or sketch them or paint them. But she was also influenced by other painters that, audiences in New York may not be as familiar with, like Zainul Abidin, who was a painter in Bangladesh, who was known for his what are called these famine sketches in the 1940s. He also painted portraits of refugees in Palestinian camps, refugee camps in Syria and Jordan in the 1970s. And here, this is a series of works called the Cambodian Refugee Series that Pasita made when she was living in Thailand. They were in Bangkok, and she was visiting many of the refugee camps during the Cambodian Civil War, and the refugee crisis there, where, thousands and thousands of refugees were fleeing Cambodia, going to the border of Cambodia and Thailand, and one of her sisters actually happened to be a medical technician at these camps, and so she would visit her sister, visit with many journalists, and she really saw at this point herself as almost like a journalist. It kind of sharpened her focus, she said, as a painter. She felt like she was a painter with social responsibility. And again, she was very much drawn to depicting mothers and women and children because, of course, the majority of refugees are women and children, and she wanted to make a point about that. This is an incredible mural-sized painting that she made in 1980. And so, again, she had just learned how to, really paint or sketch or draw. And then just in a matter of years, she was already working big. So she was such a bold artist and had such ambition. But she really saw this work, it's called Flight to Freedom, and it depicts a group of Cambodian refugees who are, an intergenerational group that are carrying everything that they had with them. And it's based on her own, photographs, as well as photographs that she saw in different newspapers. But she really saw this as a traveling mural. So it was on canvas, but then it was rolled. And so again, this too wasn't stretched. And the idea, she said, was, she really wanted to make sure that when people saw her art, she has this great quote where she says, when the media coverage ends, I want to make sure that my paintings are still staring at you. And so she wanted to drive, not just empathy, but also she wanted to drive people to action. So from that early series of social realist works, as she was traveling around to different countries, she created an entire body of work that she called the Masks and Spirits series. She was really drawn to different textile traditions, as I mentioned, jewelry making traditions, and masking traditions. In particular, she was really interested in the notion of masking as a form or a tool for storytelling, both individual storytelling, collective forms of myth making, and she was really interested in masking and its participation in different religious and spiritual ceremonies, both in the Philippines, throughout Southeast Asia, and in different parts of Africa where she visited. And so these are all done in her trapunto technique, and you can see in the image on the top left, she also loved teaching students and would host so many different workshops in mask making or teaching her trapunto technique. And you can see some of her trapuntos actually hanging in the back of the classroom because she would just roll them up and carry them with her. This is a mask that was based on Indonesian shadow puppets. And on the top right here, you'll see one of her major public commissions that was actually on view in Washington, D.C. for a period of 3 years from 1990 to 1993. It's called Masks from Six Continents, and for the exhibition, we were able to bring these 6 works back together again for the first time in 30 years. And so the masks, each one, she said, represents, one of the habitable continents, starting with, on the very left is Hopi mask to represent North America, Oceania mask, Dancing Demon, Mayan mask to represent South America, Congo to represent Africa, Subali to represent Southeast Asia or Asia more generally. And then on the very right, and I know it's a little hard to see in this image, but she has a work called European Mask. And this, if you think about this body of work, she was kind of specifying different indigenous groups to represent kind of each of the continents. But for Europe, it's kind of a very, homogenous titling, just European Mask. And in doing that, she was really kind of, turning back the European, the colonial gaze onto European modernism and many of those painters who are, of course, appropriating African art forms into their making. The exhibition also includes a number of clothing items that she intervened in. So she also rendered herself as a masked figure. And so on the left is a work called Pasita Sailing, and on the right is a jacket that she made that she would wear, and on the bottom is a shirt that she made for her husband, Jack. And actually the top right, that logo became her kind of self-portrait. And so she would, render that logo on her clothing, on business cards, on letterhead. So it's something that she very much identified with. She also worked in ceramics. So I'm hoping you get a sense in just seeing some of her works that she really, again, made no distinction between, what she would render or make on the wall or in her home. There was very little distinction between what we might think of as art or craft. And so there was a real openness and a permissiveness to her making. And so this masked work, it's probably her most ambitious trapunto painting on the left, and it's called Marcos and His Cronies. I think it's over 16 feet tall, and we couldn't actually fit it in our gallery space at the Walker, so we had to put it in one of our public spaces to accommodate the massiveness of the work. But it's a mask that she made in different panels because it's so big, that she initially, based it on a Sri Lankan mask that you can see a postcard that we found in her archives that was, one of the influences for this work. And so it's based on this Maha Kola mask, which is kind of this demon masked figure. And it's, these masks are worn during these rituals to kind of banish diseases or illnesses from people who are afflicted with, a certain illness. And so it's the demon figure in the center and then kind of these other demons on kind of either side. And as she was making this in, 1985, this is when she started it, there was a lot of protest and the starts of protest against the Marcos dictatorship at that time. And so she started off making this, medicine man mask, and then she thought, actually, this is a really interesting transposition of Marcos and his cronies onto these figures. And so she rendered actually Marcos as that central demon figure, and then all his cronies on either side. And then the mask on the bottom, when you see it in person, it's actually very heavily bejeweled, and that was to represent Imelda Marcos. So much of her work, had such a political, bent to it because of her, of course, her family background, her time in the Philippines, but also when she came to the United States, she made an entire body of work called the Immigrant Experience Series. And the work was really inspired by a trip that she took to Ellis Island. She talks about how when she came to the United States and, she was applying for her own citizenship. She went to Ellis Island and was reading through all the materials there and found that there was very little mention of immigrants, coming from Asia or Latin America or Africa. And of course, she recognized that, many immigrants from these parts of the world didn't necessarily come through Ellis Island, but she said, where is, our history? So this body of work was actually to create a narrative and to give visibility to other histories histories that weren't in the official literature at the time. So this is an incredible work. It's called L.A. Liberty. And here she, of course, renders, the monochromatic neoclassical Statue of Liberty as a woman of color. And it's, literally beams of color shooting from her. But you also see, this brown woman, and it could potentially be a self-portrait of the artist, although she had, a friend in mind. But you see this, central figure with such a kind of a steely, determined gaze. And I love that the torch is replaced with a paintbrush. And then I just want to show you the back of this work because, I mentioned that every square inch of her works are hand-stitched. And a work like this, I think it's about maybe 8 feet to 10 feet tall. And so she would hand-stitch every single trapunto painting. So you see all the labor that went into it and all the determination and the creativity. And she was matching, each of the threads to each of the paint colors that she was using. And so when you look at these works in person, they have this incredible dimensionality to them, and she loved the irregular nature that hand-stitching allowed for. So she absolutely refused to use a machine that probably would have made her life a lot easier, but she liked the irregularity that hand-stitching introduced. So this series, she did a lot of research, and we found in the archives too these incredible books where she was cutting out different newspaper articles that resonated with her and the immigrant experience. There was works like this called Korean Shopkeepers, made right after the Los Angeles uprising in the early 90s, where African American communities and Korean immigrant communities were really pitted against one another. And then you see, in the detail shot too, some of kind of like the paper mache strawberries that she would add to her trapunto paintings. So they were painted, they were stitched, but then they were also heavily embellished, whether with paper mache like this, or she would use buttons and beads and cowrie shells, mirrors, all these different techniques that she actually picked up on her travels and then incorporated into her making. And then there are works, like this, which I think these are kind of a diptych of sorts. On the left is a work that says, an American dream, and then on the right is an American reality. And of course, the work on the right is called I Thought the Streets Were Paved with Gold. And so on the left, you see kind of these visions of material wealth, perhaps, that immigrants may come to America with, and then on the right, the real kind of the day-to-day realities and the labor on which much of the country is built. And then one of the last series that we show in the exhibition is Pasita's abstractions. And while the abstractions may not immediately seem, political, they also have this political undercurrent in very interesting ways. So this work is called Walls of Santa Mesa. And at the time when Pasita was making this work, in the decades preceding, the Marcos regime was introducing forms of Western modernism into the Philippines, and was, very much heralding kind of the clean lines and muted tones of Western modernism. And in the face of that, Pasita was actually rendering what here she describes as kind of the peeling paint of the city walls. So you see kind of, the peeling paint in the different pooling colors and different forms of graffiti. And so she was really celebrating that urban life and that urban reality in the face of, what Imelda Marcos called her city beautification project, where she was actually whitewashing, city walls, and actually even creating false walls, erecting false walls to hide these unruly, colorful walls. So I love that Pasita was actually, creating her abstractions out of, based on the urban landscape. And then in works like this, on the right, there's a work, this is called Life in the Margins. And then there's this work here on the right is called White Heightens an Awareness of the Senses. And so again, at the outset, they don't necessarily read as political works, but I love to think about these works in relation to this quote that one of Pasita's peers, Emma Amos, who's also an artist who worked in textiles and painting, she says, for me, anytime I use color, it's a political statement. I would love to be, love not to have the luxury of not to think about color. And so I think Pasita used color in a very similar way. Color for her was very intentional. It was very pointed. And you see that especially in some of these works where, this one again is called Life in the Margins. She talks about herself as, especially in the context of the United States, as being someone who she felt existed on the periphery or lived life in the margins. She couldn't get access to, quote unquote, mainstream art spaces. She couldn't show her place, at places like the Walker. She tried. And one, we found in the archives where she actually sent so many letters, trying to get her work into different museums and got huge stacks of rejections. So it's only now that the art world is kind of, starting to come around to artists like Pasita. This is also a later abstraction, and I just wanted to show this image just to show, again, kind of how she embellished every aspect of her life. And so this is not quite trapunto painting, but she used more of an applique technique. And so you see a fabric scrapbook that we found in the archives, and she would take these different, scraps of batik or other fabric, and then she would actually sew them onto her canvas, and then on top of that paint, different patterns. So it was a multi-layered process that I absolutely love. And then this is the coffee table that I showed you earlier in an installation shot. Every corner of their house was also covered in fabric. And Jack has a great story about how he came home one day and found that actually their car seats had been reupholstered with ikat fabric as well. This is the front and back of another work. And so you'll see in a number of these slides, I am showing the fronts and backs, again, because the backs sometimes are so interesting and unexpected in relation to the front sides. But it's this beautiful abstraction on the front. One of her more later works called I Have 1 Million Things to Say. And on the back, then you can see, how those scraps were stitched onto the canvases. And so at the Walker, the final series that we end on, though it's not, chronologically the last series that she worked on, because she kind of worked on all series at once, and had a real fluidity to her practice, is the Underwater Wilderness series. And so this is a body of work that she made in the mid-'80s, and it really celebrates kind of the flora and fauna of the subaquatic realms. And she showed it first in the Philippines at the Ayala Museum in Makati, and in 1986. And these are just some installation shots from that exhibition. We tried to recreate it as much as we could at the Walker. We couldn't go, all the way to the extent that Pasita kind of covered every surface in the galleries, but she, had things hanging from the ceiling. She made soft squid that she was hanging. She had sand and seashells strewn on the ground, fishing nets, attached to the walls, and then her trapunto paintings as well. And for someone who, was so drawn to color and pattern and texture, for her, scuba diving was kind of this dreamscape where she just saw so many rich colors and marine life, and she had a really great sensitivity to kind of these underwater ecosystems, and wanted to share with people above water kind of all this richness and beauty of life underseas. And so I'm just going to end on this photo here because I think it gives you a really good sense of kind of the exuberance of Pasita as an artist and a person. She showed up to the opening of that exhibition in scuba gear and, full on kind of her snorkel, her goggles, her fins, her oxygen tank. But she was an artist who truly was just full of energy and passion and experimentation. And the thing that I love so much about her was that, she didn't ask for permission to do anything. I mean, she, was very well informed about what was going on in Western art worlds, in, art worlds in other countries and other cities, because so much of her making was about making community with other artists. And she kind of mashed it all together into a single practice. And so it's a really exuberant body of work that, I think with this exhibition, I hope people will take more seriously, but also have fun with it. Because I think, Pasita was an artist who had so much fun in her making, and I think that comes through in her practice. Thank you.